All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another class. Like I said, I just knocked over my tripod and broke the part of it that holds my phone. So I'm going to have this in a little bit of an unusual configuration for right now. Hopefully it will stay where I'm putting it. So some of you did and some of you didn't make it to the herb walk on Saturday. It was a real nice day out and saw a lot of interesting plants. I'm going to go ahead and put a link in the chat box, which I will put in the comments later when this is uploaded. No, that's not it. Just a second. All right. Save that link. That's the video for the video of the herb walk, and hopefully you get a chance to watch that sometime in the near future. If you are going out into the natural world, you'll probably notice that some things are starting to come into fruit right now pretty significantly. Specifically, mulberries are ripe at this moment, as are service berries. If you aren't familiar with those, you can look them up and see what they look like. Both of them are ripe here in Kentucky right now. So they're a good thing to know about if you like the idea of going out and finding them and harvesting some. They're both things that you could harvest a large amount of pretty easily. They're both berries that grow on trees. Mulberries aren't technically berries, but for culinary purposes they are. And they grow on trees, and they're both pretty abundant right now and ripe in this environment. You know, if you live further north or further south, that time might be shifted a little bit. But here in central Kentucky, they're ripe at the moment and will continue to be ripe and available for a little bit of time. About the time that they are finishing up, black raspberries will be ripe. And about the time, or towards the end of the time that black raspberries are available, blackberries will become ripe. Black raspberries and blackberries are very closely related, but slightly different. More different from a flavor and texture perspective than from a nutritional or medicinal perspective. But those are both coming ripe in the very near future. And about the time that blackberries finish being ripe, walnuts will start getting ripe. So this is really a big time in the natural world for the production of fruits. And this is kind of what you might call high summer from now through August. It's a very productive time when there are not as many flowers as there were in May and in April, but lots of fruits and lots of flowers, and an ever shifting landscape of what's blooming and what's ripe and what's about to bloom and things like that. So these next few months, if you're doing your plant collection, are really vital times, really important times to get out there. It's some of the easiest times to find different plants in flower to collect and to start cataloging and all of that. And you could physically collect them or you could take pictures of them, either way. But find them, identify them, get to know them. And now is a great time for that. Now is a time when there's a lot of abundance, whereas after October, there will be not so much for a few months. There will be some things, but not so much for a few months. So, having said all of that, today's main topic is about production, and specifically about some of the simple ways to make medicine out of plants. With any skilled trade, which I think of herbal medicine as being a skilled trade, along the lines of carpentry or bricklaying or being an electrician or a plumber or anything like that. It's something that you learn partly through lessons like this, and also partly through hands-on experience, on-the-job training, mentorship, things like that. So with any trade like that, there's essentially three parts. There's theory, there's practice, and then there's production. And theory is kind of like the idea behind things, how things work. Practice is the service that you're providing, and production is the making of products, making of goods. So all three of those are a big part of herbal medicine, and as a serious student of herbal medicine, you should try and balance your experience of those things. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the most basic types of, a couple of the most basic ways of producing herbal medicines, specifically making an infusion, sometimes known as an herbal tea, and making a tincture. So those are some very basic things to make, and we're going to talk about one technique for making each of those. Don't think that this is the only way to make a tincture, or that this is the only way to make an infusion, because there are many varied approaches to this sort of thing. But we're going to talk about just kind of a very basic, very versatile way of doing it today. So the goal when you're making these things would both collectively be referred to as liquid extracts. Okay, you are taking what is in the herb, the substances that are in the herb, and you're extracting them, that is drawing them out into a liquid, into a carrier that is a liquid that can be taken internally or applied externally or whatever. So there are certain principles and ideas that apply to both situations, and then there are some differences between them. So I'm going to talk about, first I'm going to talk about making an infusion, which is just kind of making a hot water infusion, which is arguably the most basic way to prepare an herb for consumption, other than just eating the herb itself. With some fresh herbs, you can just pick them and eat them. You don't really have to do anything else to them. But with a lot of things, that's not really a good approach. You wouldn't want to just like try to eat willow bark or cherry bark, for instance. The texture would be terrible, the taste would be terrible, and probably you wouldn't be able to digest it effectively, because you're just not a beaver and you're not meant for eating the bark off of trees. So how do people deal with that? What do people do with dried plant material to make it into medicine? They make tea out of it. That's kind of the most basic approach. Pour hot water on it and you let it sit until the hot water turns into herbal medicine. And that works for most things. That works for a surprisingly wide variety of medicinal plants. And one of the reasons that it works for a surprisingly wide variety of them is because all plants contain water. All plants use water to make these substances and to transport these substances within themselves. Now, not all plant substances will dissolve in water, but most of them will, well over half of them. There are some things like, for example, coconut oil. It won't mix with water. If you pour hot water on it, it will melt and it will float to the surface, and you'll just have two separate things. But most things, the acids, the alkaloids, the various other substances that are in them, starches, sugars, they'll all dissolve in water. So that is kind of, and because water is so abundant, and because, we have always had, wherever there are people, there's water, or else nobody lives there. So it's always been an abundant resource, unlike something like, say, alcohol or a carrier oil or something like that that might require some production facilities to make, or something like that. Water is just kind of generally abundant. It falls from the sky, it comes up out of holes in the ground, and people are used to having a fair bit of it around. So the proportions that people use are not the most important thing. And a lot of the time when people are thinking about making herbal medicines, they kind of get lost in the proportions, like how much water do I use for how much herb? And that's a reasonable question, but there are other much more important things that I want to talk about first. And when it comes to that, there are no hard and fast rules either. It's quite variable how you go about that, and you can get good results approaching that question from many different angles. But what I want to first talk about is what happens when you're making an extract out of an herb. So let's say, for instance, that you have let's say you have some raspberry leaf, just some dried herb, and you want to make it into a tea, or maybe one that we've already talked about, some nettle leaf, and you want to make it into a tea. You want to make medicine out of it rather than just eating the dried leaves. So you would put this medicine, you'd put this herb in a container, pour some boiling water over it. I mean, bring the water to a boil and pour it over it. You don't want to cook the herb itself in this case. That's a different kind of preparation that we'll talk about on a different day. But in this case of making infusion, you just want to bring the water to the herb and pour the water over the herb, and then put a lid on it, cover it. Maybe if it's in a jar, you screw the lid on. Maybe if it's in something like a teapot, you just sit the lid on top of it. But essentially what you've done when you do that is you've created a closed system. Everything, all the substances that are in that jar, in that container, are going to stay in that container until you let them out. That means that if there are aromatic compounds, things that would evaporate into the air, they're not going to leave the container. They're going to evaporate out of the herb, and then they're going to condense on the side of the container, and then they're going to drain back into the liquid. So they're not getting away. And that's an important thing, because if you just have like an open pot of water and you pour the herbs on top of it, the steam that's coming up out of that is going to carry some of the medicinal virtues of the herb away with it. It's going to evaporate some of the compounds that are capable of evaporating out of the plant material. We call those volatile compounds. It just means that they can evaporate, that they can fly away, literally. That vola part means flight in Latin. So it means that they can fly away, that they can evaporate. So we put a lid on it to keep them from flying away. And then there are also the non-volatile compounds which can't evaporate, which are not inclined to at any rate. So all of that stays together in this scenario. And what happens when the herb is in the water is a process called diffusion. Diffusion is a process by which things in a liquid move from an area of higher concentration to an area of less concentration until the concentration becomes the same all throughout the liquid. A common way of demonstrating this as an experiment would be to have some water and put a drop of ink in it, some sort of water-soluble ink in it. And at first, If you've ever seen something like this happen, there will be sort of cloud-like shapes of the ink as it spreads out through the water. And eventually it will get to a point where the ink is all spread all throughout the water, as long as it's a water-soluble ink. And that same thing is happening with your substances in your herbs, your tannic acids and your esters and volatile compounds, even tiny droplets of essential oil. They're all just sort of being spread from the plant out into the water that's closest to the plant and slowly diffusing throughout the entire liquid. Excuse me. And eventually this will reach a point where it's isotonic, where the whole liquid contains the same amount of the substances that were in the plant material. Practically speaking, sometimes there's some stuff that stays in the plant material a little more than it diffuses out into the rest of it. But for the most part, after a few hours, it diffuses out pretty well. So to go back to the example of the nettle leaves, you pour the hot water over them, you screw the lid on, and you leave it for, say, 8 hours or so. With nettle leaf, it takes longer than with some other compounds. But if you do that, by the next morning, by the next day sometime, it's going to have gotten as strong as it's going to get. And letting it sit longer wouldn't make it any stronger. It would just make it older, and eventually it might go bad or something like that. But it's going to reach its maximum strength. It's going to have the situation where the leaf material contains the same amount of nettle medicine as the part of the liquid that's furthest away from the leaf material. Let's see. Would the leaves still be edible? Yeah, they'd still be edible. I mean, they would not necessarily, depending on the quality of the leaves. Like if they were fresh leaves and you did that to them, yeah, then you could still eat them. They would still contain fiber. They would still contain some minerals and stuff. Some of the things that don't dissolve out of them. But as far as the soluble minerals that are going to dissolve into the water and the acids and things like that, most of the secondary phytochemicals, the plant medicine that makes it do what it does, that's mostly going to come out into the water. And there's going to be as much of it in the leaf as there is in the water, but or as there is in a similar quantity of water. So it's not as though the leaves have lost all of it. They're the same strength as the tea is, basically. And that's about as good as it gets. And so how long that takes is very different for different medicines. With nettle, like I said, it often takes several hours. With chamomile, it would just take a couple hours. With black tea, it would just maybe take an hour or so. It's pretty quick. It's going to happen pretty quick. Some substances diffuse much quicker than others. So the caffeine that's in tea diffuses into hot water very quickly, really in a matter of seconds to minutes, rather than minutes to hours. So probably if you poured hot water over tea, the caffeine in the solution would be about as strong as it's going to get, maybe a minute later, maybe a couple minutes later, depending on the texture of the tea. The tannic acid, the stuff that makes it dark colored, that's going to take a few more minutes to get out into the liquid. And there are other substances too. So it's important not to think of an herb as just being one individual important substance. There are lots of them that go together and that work together. But how quickly the substances diffuse from the plant material into the liquid depends on a few things. One of them is how soluble that substance is. So some things dissolve in alcohol or in water very quickly. Some things do so more slowly. Generally speaking, minerals dissolve more slowly into liquid. Acids and salts, acids and salts are minerals. Salts dissolve pretty quickly. Some other mineral compounds take longer. Plant proteins take longer, and so forth. So there's various different things as far as that goes. But beyond that, there are a few other, and that's just a matter of the nature of that particular plant, and it's not something you can do much about. But there are some other features that do affect how quick things diffuse into the liquid. One of those is the temperature of the liquid. So if you're using boiling water, you know, the water when it's boiling is about 100 degrees Celsius, and slowly going to cool down from there. How slowly depends on how insulated the container is, but it won't get any hotter than that. If you use cold water, it's going to infuse much more slowly. There are still reasons why you might want to use cold water in certain situations for certain substances, but in general, it's going to make it infuse much more slowly. Another thing that affects it is the surface area of the plant material. So to give an example of that, if you put a root, just like a whole root, in some boiling water, there's going to be a limited amount of that root surface that the water can touch. Now, if you split that root into some lengthwise slices, you're going to have more surface area that the water is in contact with because you've created more surfaces by slicing it up. If you chop it into very fine pieces, you've made even more surfaces. And if you grind it into powder, you've made even more. So the more finely broken up into pieces it is, the more surface area it likely has. And the more surface area it has, the more quickly stuff from it is going to get out of the solid material and into the liquid. And then another thing that comes into play there is movement of the material itself. So if you shake something or stir it or press on it as it's infusing, it will make it infuse a little bit faster. Also, if you're pouring water continuously through it instead of just allowing it to sit, that has some pros and cons, but it will make it infuse faster. So most of the time, this isn't something I bother with. If I'm allowing something to infuse, I probably just let it sit and don't try to speed it up by shaking it, because it's not going to speed it up that much. I mean, you know, maybe if I vigorously shook something, it would get done in 4 hours instead of 8. But most of the time, if I'm planning ahead, you know, that's not really a concern for me. If I were trying to make somebody a cup of tea to take right away, I might squeeze the plant material and squeeze the good stuff out of it into the liquid, so that it's ready to go more immediately. But those are some different things that affect how quickly the infusion process takes place. Once the infusion process is done, it's generally a good idea to strain the plant material out of the liquid. That way, rather than giving someone a slurry of leaves, you're giving them a nice drinkable liquid. There are situations like a poultice where you don't care about that necessarily. You might just wrap the wet leaves in some kind of a material and put that on the skin for a topical treatment for something. But if somebody's taking it internally, you generally want to strain it. They'll be glad that you did. So it can be strained through paper. It can be strained through fabric like muslin or cheesecloth. It can be strained through mesh. Some of the stuff I have, I strained through gold-plated wire mesh, which is nice because it doesn't rust, and so you don't get any rust contaminating flavoring or contaminating or otherwise interacting with the medicine. But this is mainly for texture and pleasantness and ease of use. So kind of the opposite of the surface area thing with infusion. The smaller the pieces are, the harder it is to strain. So if you make something out of powder, it can be very hard to get the liquid separated from the powder again, because you end up with something like mud if it's finely powdered enough. So a lot of the time, small pieces tends to be more what I go for. I'll put something in a mortar and pestle and break it up into pieces, but I typically won't try to powder it if I'm trying to make this kind of extract from it, just because of the difficulty of sorting, taking the powder back out of the liquid. Now, if it's something that's going to sit for a longer term, like a tincture, a lot of the time you can just wait for the powder to settle to the bottom and then pour off the liquid. But with infusions, you're usually using them the same day, the next day, something like that, maybe over the course of the next few days, but not keeping them for a super long time. And so, that might, trying to let it settle might not be an ideal solution. Let's see. So as far as proportions go, a lot of the time I'll do something like a couple ounces of herb in a pint of water. That's a pretty decent strength of infusion. If you're used to teas, a lot of the time it's a tea bag, which is maybe a couple grams of the herb, maybe less than a gram in some cases, in a 4-ounce cup of hot water. The important thing is you pay attention to the amount of herb that you're using and not the amount of liquid that you're using. And so that when you're giving it to somebody, you're giving them that amount of the herb. Think about the amount of the herb that's going into the person and not the amount of liquid that it's diffused in. Because your body can handle the water. Your body is going to use the water to move it around, and it's not that different from taking a very concentrated product and then drinking a glass of water versus taking a less concentrated product that has more water in it. It's going to get diluted in your entire 1.5 gallons or so of bloodstream anyway. And so it's not the dosage should be reckoned based on the amount of herb that you're using. So if you use an ounce of herb to make a pint of tincture, and then the person drinks half of that, then think of it as having taken the equivalent of half of an ounce of the herb. So that's the easiest way to think of it. And like I said, with these products, with infusions, you're typically making them for use at the moment and not for later use. That's not always true. There might be some situations where you make a big batch of tea to use over the course of a few days for a group of people or something like that. But even then, you want to focus on not the amount of the extract, but the amount of the herb that went into the extract as being the relevant factor for how much of it you're giving to a person. And most of the herbs that we're going to be talking about this year, with very few exceptions, are things that are very well tolerated. If you take too much of them, they're not going to hurt you. That's not true of all herbs by any means, but it's going to be true of the vast majority of the ones that we're talking about in the course of this class. So yeah, not as important that it be the same every time you make it, but important that you be able to reckon how much of the herb you're giving the person, even if it's in a different amount of water. Hang on just a moment, I'll be right back. Ooh, okay. So, any questions about infusions before I move on to talking about tinctures? All right. So, tinctures are alcohol and water extracts of herbs. And the term tincture is actually an old word meaning tint or coloring. And that's because the coloring comes out of the herb, the things that make it have its color come out of the herb into the liquid in the case of a tincture. So it's like you're extracting the color from the plant, which is true of other forms of extract as well, but for whatever reason, the alcohol and water extract ended up being the one usually referred to as a tincture. Sometimes you'll see people talk about glycerin tinctures or something else like that. I usually would refer to just those as just extracts rather than tinctures for the sake of clarity. So the specific kind of tincture that I'm going to talk about right now is a 5-to-1 tincture with 50% alcohol, by which I mean 5 parts of alcohol per 1 part of water. So 500 milliliters of alcohol to 100 grams of plant material, of dried plant material. And this is a very standard, very common proportion to use. The main reason that we would do it this way instead of some other way is so that you have a consistent strength, so that you know you're making it the same way every time. So that's kind of more important with tinctures because you are keeping them for long periods of time. You want to know, you just want to have the liquid itself be dosable, and you can send it home with somebody and tell them, take 1 teaspoon of this every day, or take 1 milliliter of this 3 times a day, or something like that. Okay, so listen carefully. The ratio is 5-to-1. That's 5 parts of the liquid to 1 part of the plant material. So that's and this is generally how we would do it with dry plant material. This is a fairly standard ratio that a lot of herbalists use. And so a lot of the time that allows people to, if they're getting something from a different person, it's a similar product, and, makes it more familiar and more standardized. And making it the same way every time allows you to have a consistent medicine to be able to give to somebody. If it works, you want to be able to keep doing it. So that's 500 milliliters, in other words, half a liter of 50% alcohol to 100 grams of the dried plant material. So it's a lot easier to do this with metric measurements than it is with imperial measurements. So yeah, 5-to-1, 50% alcohol. A lot of the time in practice, I use a lesser concentration of alcohol. If you know what you're trying to extract from the plants, you can tweak that a little bit, but 50% alcohol works reasonably well for just about everything. So, well, for most things anyway. So 5-to-1, 50% is the proportion you want to use. And that's, well, at least that's the proportion we're going to learn about today. And that's a widely used proportion, widely used concentration and preparation. So let's see. With the alcohol, you can buy 50% alcohol in the form of vodka, which is also called 100 proof here in the United States. So it's slightly higher concentration than usual, but it's readily obtainable. Some people think that vodka is made of a specific from a specific thing like potatoes or whatever, but it doesn't have to be. It can be made from almost anything. Most of it's made from corn. So it's basically just alcohol from the still diluted to a standard 50% of alcohol. And that's would be called 100 proof vodka. And it will also say 50% alcohol by volume somewhere on the label. A lot of it's made here in Kentucky. Like I said, most of it's made out of corn. Some of it's made out of other things. It doesn't always stay on the label, but that's something that you can use for a lot of different plants. It won't ever go bad, as far as like it won't ever spoil. The plant medicine will eventually degrade in a lot of them, in a lot of tinctures, but the extract itself won't ever spoil, mold or anything like that, because the concentration of alcohol is too much for any kind of microorganism to live in by a lot. So they're very shelf stable. You don't have to refrigerate them. It's a good idea to keep them in the dark, but if you're not keeping them for very long, if you're going to use them up quickly, that doesn't matter as much. Most of the time in the clinic, I keep a lot of my tinctures in amber glass jars. Larger amber glass jars are not easy to find anymore, but smaller ones are. And so it can be a good thing to keep them in. If you don't have those, keeping them in a dark closet or something like that can be just as effective. Sunlight or bright light eventually breaks down some plant material, some plant compounds. Also, some plant compounds will just break down no matter what you do, and even if you store them perfectly, they're not going to last all that long. So most of the time, I keep tinctures for about a year. Some tinctures will keep for 5 years just fine, but pretty much any of them will keep for a year. If you try to keep echinacea much longer than a year, it starts to lose some of its potency. When you taste echinacea tincture, it makes your tongue tingle. It has this very unique feel on your tongue that it and a few other plants have. It's not really something we would typically call a taste, but it sort of is. But that goes away if you have something that's 2 years old. Even if it's been stored well and everything, most of that's going to be gone. It's just a big molecule that breaks apart into smaller molecules over the course of time. It's a fragile molecule, and so it doesn't last. But most things will last for at least a year, at least long enough for you to harvest it again and make it again. So back to the production of them. A lot of the same principles as what I said with the infusion, as far as the more surface area it has, the more quickly it's going to infuse, and the fact that some things infuse much quicker than others. And that has a lot to do with the texture of the plant material. One thing that I sometimes make that takes a long time is a tincture of whole garlic cloves. If I chop them up, they would oxidize some and it would change the flavor of them a little bit, a small amount, but it would be a change that I could notice. And that takes, so I just put them straight in, and because they're whole, because they are, they've got kind of a water resistant texture and structure with layers and layers of vascular material, it takes a long time for that to turn into a tincture. After a month, it still looks pretty clear. It's more like 3 months for that to really turn into the tincture that it's going to be. But most things take about a month. The liquid part of a tincture is called the menstruum, and that comes from the Latin word for month, because it takes about a month to really get the good stuff out of most plants into a tincture. Really, a lot of the time it doesn't take that long, but it's traditional to let it try for that long to make sure you're getting the good stuff out of them. Some things really do take that long, or sometimes even longer. Some other things, like, for example, this myrrh gum right here, this dissolves in the alcohol pretty much right away. So, there's not really, it's little beads of sap, little beads of tree sap, dried tree sap, and it just kind of, it gets wet and then it melts into the liquid, and then it's, there's nothing else to extract. Except little bits of wood chips or whatever that were stuck to the tree sap. But so that happens very quickly. Some other things that have a lot of resin in them extract very quickly. Some things that have a more water resistant texture extract very slowly. And then also, depending on whether something is in a powdered form or whether it's in a large chunk or whatever, that affects it a lot. Typically, we don't heat tinctures when we're making them. You might damage some of the plant compounds by doing it. Alcohol evaporates, alcohol turns into vapor and builds up vapor pressure pretty easily. So you would either have to not have the system be sealed, in which case some stuff might evaporate, or you would have to have the system be pressurized, which runs the risk of it shattering on you or breaking or something. So usually we don't heat tinctures as we're making them. There are some exceptions to that, which we will get into in future tincture making classes. But for making this basic 5-to-1, 50% alcohol tincture, just do it at room temperature and let it sit for about a month. Maybe come and look at it occasionally, shake it around a little bit, something like that. And that is a good way to make a good basic tincture, a good basic extract that you can use with all sorts of different plants. It works well with dandelion leaves. It works well with burdock roots, works well with cayenne, garlic, works with all sorts of different things. There are very few things where it just wouldn't work. So it's a good basic. If you just know one way of making a shelf-stable extract, let it be that. I've got a couple of questions here. So, does violet leaf keep for longer than a year? And how long do they last just as dry herbs? So, as dry herbs, it's pretty variable, but if they're in a sealed container where stuff can't evaporate easily, then often they will last, they might last a year. If they're kept very well, not too hot, not exposed to sunlight, not in a thing where they can evaporate, where good stuff can evaporate away from them, then they'll last, then they can last a year. If they are in a paper bag, they won't last as long because some of the good stuff in them will evaporate out. If they're left in the sunlight, they'll break down pretty quickly and start looking like yellowish hay. If they're, it has a lot to do with the care that you take of it, but you can keep them for a year, and that applies to violet leaves as well. You can keep them for a year if you keep them well. I usually wouldn't keep them longer than that, although some of the stuff that's in them is unlikely to go away. Like the salicin, which is one of the main ingredients, one of the main constituents, I should say, in violet leaves, is pretty stable. It's pretty unlikely to go anywhere. So as long as the plant material isn't destroyed, it's likely to still be in there. But you would probably lose some of the other compounds that are in the leaf. So, it's like, it's not an all or nothing thing, but you would lose some of the quality. So after you've let the tincture steep for about a month or so, you'll probably have had all the plant substances diffuse throughout the entire liquid. And then you can strain it if you choose to. I don't always strain the stuff that I'm using, but what you don't want is a situation where you've poured off half of it and you have some plant material that's up out of the liquid just sitting in the air unpreserved and maybe growing mold or something like that. So, it's usually a good idea, especially if you're going to use it slowly over a period of time, to strain the tincture and take away the plant material and compost it and then keep the liquid. And sometimes, because tinctures are more concentrated, because you're using more plant material per liquid, sometimes you really have to fight to get the liquid back out of the plant material. So for instance, if I make a jar of chamomile tincture, the chamomile is very sponge-like. It's lots of little flowers and they soak up much of the liquid. And when I strain that, what I'm going to have to do is pour it into a little mesh bag and then squeeze the plant material and squeeze the liquid out of it. There are more sophisticated ways of doing that. There are tincture presses, which are machines that use hydraulic or other pressure, mechanical pressure, to squeeze the plant material. This plant material that's left over at the end of a tincture is called the marc, M-A-R-C. Squeeze the marc and squeeze the liquid out of it. If you just pour it into a strainer, like a screen type of strainer, and let it sit, a lot of it will drain out. But you will have to wring some of it out. And that's true with a lot of plant material, because the plant material is designed to soak up water and it will soak up tincture just as much. And so you often have to wring some of your tincture back out of your plant material. But the nice thing about that is you do get a nice concentrated medicine, a nice strong medicine that can be taken in spoonful size doses rather than cupful size doses. So that is, tinctures are tinctures are definitely the form of medicine that I use most in my clinical practice for a few different reasons. One is that they're shelf stable and I can just keep all of them here in this room with me without any special kind of refrigeration or anything like that. They're concentrated, so I don't have to have them taking up a big amount of room, and they're easy to get people to use. When I first started practicing as an herbalist, I would make up teas for people and I would say, go home, take so many spoonfuls of this, brew them in this much water, drink that 3 times a day, and come back and talk to me in a week. And they'd come back and talk to me in a week, and I'd say, how are things going? And they say, well, not really any different. And I was like, okay, do you need more of the tea? And they're like, no, I haven't used any of it. And so even though I felt like that was a superior form of medicine because it didn't have the alcohol in it and because it was a more natural way of consuming it, what I found was that the vast majority of people were not going to be bothered with it. So I, shifted what I was doing, because no matter how good medicine is, it won't do any good if somebody doesn't take it. So tinctures are convenient for people to use, and so it makes it easier for them to stick to the program of taking a certain amount every day and that sort of thing, which can be really important to getting the outcome you want. So that is generally the process for making tinctures. Like I said, once you strain them, if you can, storing them in dark colored glass is helpful. Storing them out of direct sunlight is helpful. And often I will keep them in larger jars to store, and then I will pour them off into little tincture bottles, dropper bottles, or 4-ounce or 8-ounce bottles for people to use. And that's been my system for decades now, and it seems to work pretty well. So, any questions about making that particular type of tincture? Later on, we'll talk about some other forms of medicine making, including oils and including extracts that involve both hot water and alcohol in separate phases. We call those dual extractions. And when you would want to do those and why you would want to do them and things like that. So the art of medicine making is a huge field. But if you learn a few simple things, you can do most of what you need to do with that. And so this is a really good place to start. And I very strongly encourage anybody who's listening to this to attempt it, to get some herbs, get some consumable alcohol, some 50% vodka or something like that, and try making some tinctures. Try making 2 or 3 things that you like using as medicinal herbs, or that you like the idea of having around, and making extracts out of them. It's not so daunting once you get a little bit of practice, and it's a very good life skill. It's a very good thing to be able to do. It's very empowering, and gives you a lot of options as far as being able to make medicine and treat the people around you. Yeah, so this should comment that one concern is the effect of the alcohol on the microbiome. And that's something that can be an issue. And for some people, it seems to be much more of an issue than for others. Some people have to avoid alcohol completely. And for in that case, an infusion is a better thing to do. A lot of the time, using a very diluted alcohol, like if you take, let's say you were going to use a teaspoon of a particular extract, you could put that teaspoon of extract in a glass of water, and say in 100 milliliters of water, you could put 5 milliliters of the extract. And then it's a very tiny concentration of alcohol in that case. It's probably something your microbiome isn't going to notice, because some alcohol is produced in your gut anyway. And, there are other things that have similar effects to it as well. But for some people, it's just, it doesn't work for them at all. But a lot of the time, even in people who don't metabolize alcohol that well, if it's diluted and it's that small of an amount, it's not that, doesn't really have that noticeable of an effect. But if you find that it doesn't agree with you at all, then a strong water-based extract is good instead. So it's okay for diabetics, generally speaking, yes, because it's not it's such a small amount of alcohol in a typical dose of this sort of thing that it's not something that you typically see affecting blood sugar numbers or anything like that. All right. Okay, just a minute. I'll be right back. All right. So now I want to talk about a couple of different herbs that I feel like are really useful to know about and are very popular and well tolerated. And one of those is Camellia sinensis, otherwise known as the tea plant. So we have this kind of an unfortunate situation in English where we use the word tea to refer both to a hot water infusion, like what we talked about earlier, and also to a specific plant and the specific infusion of that plant, which is, the green tea or black tea, for instance, which are the same plant, just prepared a little bit differently. Um, so I want to talk about that plant, which is the Latin name of it is Camellia sinensis, and it's usually just called tea in English. It is one of the most widely used plants in the world, and one of the most widely traded plants in the world. There has been an international trade in tea since medieval times. It's considered, like, for instance, a very big feature of British culture, even though it doesn't really grow in Britain. So it's something that people have fought wars over, and that has been, a multinational business for centuries, and has been a very, very popular plant medicine around the world for centuries, and in the areas where it's native to in Asia for even longer than that. I remember hearing a story once about a mystic who meditated in front of a wall for several years and didn't sleep. And then one day after that, he was laying in a field in the sun and he fell asleep, and he felt like that was something he shouldn't have done. So he cut off his eyelids and threw them on the ground, and they sprouted into the first tea plant. It's probably not a true story, but I thought it was an interesting one anyway. So this plant is a stimulant, and there aren't really that many plants out there that are stimulants, in the sense that we usually use the term stimulant to mean that they, induce the endocrine system and the nervous system to be more awake, produce adrenaline, be more wakeful, that sort of thing. Caffeine is one of the main things that's in tea. There's another substance called theophylline that is also in there, that is also a stimulant. It's a very similar compound. And those two things are probably, one of the main reasons why tea has become so popular. The popularity of it also coincided with the Industrial Revolution, with industrialization and people working in factories and things like that, punching time clocks eventually, working specific hours rather than just being farmers and working while the sun was out. And so stimulants became popular in that scenario because people were using them to make themselves more productive and more able to cope with that sort of mechanized existence, which is not necessarily healthy. Stimulants can definitely be anything that interferes with your sleep, can be harmful to you. The actual stimulant effects of tea tend not to be harmful in the way that the stimulant effects of, say, ephedra might be. Things that it's not going to give you a heart attack. It's not going to make you stay awake to the point that you collapse from exhaustion typically. But it does, give people a nudge towards being more wakeful. Sometimes a pretty strong nudge. Now, the amount of caffeine that is in tea varies wildly depending on the variety and how it's produced. And that is something that you often find with cultivated plants, is that the medicinal constituents aren't consistent. With wild plants, you'll have a certain amount of a particular substance that's in the plant. That's what that plant needs to survive in the wild, maybe to keep bugs from eating it or whatever. But with, the example I often use with cultivation is peppers. You have bell peppers and cayenne peppers, which are the same species, but cultivated for different purposes, selectively bred for different purposes. And so one of them is very spicy and one of them is not. You have the same situation with tea, where some of them are bred for more caffeine, some of them are bred for more of the theophylline type effects, and some of them are bred for other constituents and other flavors and things like that. So there are a wide variety of those things with different types of tea. It's not, as some people think, based on whether it's green tea or black tea. So turning green tea into black tea doesn't make it have more caffeine in it. It's just that some of the Assam varieties of tea are usually used for black tea because they have a more robust flavor and they also have more caffeine in them. So that's kind of where that association comes from, of, breakfast tea being black tea and having a lot of caffeine in it. But it's not, if you took the same leaves from those same plants and you dried them differently and you used them as green tea, they would still have the same amount of caffeine in them. So the curing process that turns it from green tea into black tea doesn't increase the amount of caffeine. Caffeine is not the only thing that makes tea work, though. And being a stimulant to keep people awake is not the only thing that it's good for. So another thing that tea is typically associated with is it's traditionally thought of as being something that promotes longevity and generally a sense of well-being. And modern research, when they've been looking for why that is, have tended to focus on antioxidants, on substances that prevent oxidation, prevent the degradation of cells and genetic material and so forth from the presence of oxygen. So we all need oxygen to live, but oxygen is also what makes paper turn yellow and iron turn rusty and things like that. So it is a destructive force as well as a life-sustaining one. And antioxidants help to preserve things at a cellular level. And tea contains lots of them. And that might be one of the reasons why it's traditionally associated with longevity, because as our cells are making copies of themselves, replacing themselves, sometimes they make less than perfect copies of themselves. And that is probably part of what the aging process is caused by. Or so the idea goes. So that's another thing that tea has been used for and associated with, just life extension. It is mildly anti-inflammatory, often promotes a general sense of well-being. Like if people are a little bit sick, tea will make them feel a little bit better. It's also a warm, pleasant, familiar beverage, which is no small thing. If somebody's drinking a warm beverage, that can help to break up congestion. It can help to improve appetite, and having a warm beverage that people are familiar with and like the taste of is helpful with a lot of that. Some teas out there have been used as and promoted as a weight loss supplement, slim teas, things like that. And stimulants will make people lose weight sometimes, but usually not for very long. Usually they kind of make people feel less of a need to eat, but then, it can mess with somebody's metabolism long term, and it might do more harm than good, even if it temporarily results in some weight loss. So I really don't recommend that approach. I think that's kind of something that sells well, but not something that really bears out clinically as a sustainable practice or something you would want to do on an ongoing basis. So that's my opinion on that. Another thing that I use tea for is the respiratory system. If someone has exercise-induced asthma or frequent wheezing as a result of allergies, hay fever, that sort of thing, then taking a strong cup of tea on a daily basis can be part of the program to keep that from happening. The theophylline that it contains is a bronchodilator. It helps to open up the tiny airways in the chest. The air has to pass through to get to the air sacs in the lungs. And so by doing that, it can help keep the blood oxygenated and help keep away the feeling of tightness in the chest. Often I will use it along with other things in that capacity, but that is something that it's good for. It's especially, in my experience, helpful in children as opposed to adults. It's modestly helpful in adults, sometimes dramatically helpful in small children. So that's another usage of tea. Topically, it is also an astringent. So, if you have a tea bag and you use it as a poultice on a sting or on a splinter, it will tend to soothe it, maybe draw out any foreign body that might be in it. This is a feature that tea shares in common with a lot of plants, but because it is something that people often have around, it's something that is worth knowing about for that. It can be used on the eyes as well to reduce redness. In that case, usually if I'm trying to put liquid in somebody's eye or my own eye, what I would do is have the person lean their head back, put a drop right in the corner between the eye and the nose, and then have them blink to disperse that. And that's usually much easier than trying to get them to hold their eye open while something drops into it, which most people can't naturally do. And often results in people blinking or shaking their head and the stuff rolling down the side of their face. But if you just put a drop there on their closed eye and then have them blink repeatedly to disperse it, that will often get the job done. So tea can be used for, especially if somebody's eyes are really red from a non-infectious reason, like being around smoke or bad allergies or something like that. It helps to rinse them out, and it helps to get those blood vessels to go back to their regular size and not feel so red and swollen. The tea can also be used on the skin to soothe some types of inflammation and thickening, like psoriasis. So for that purpose, I would mostly use green tea type varieties. Since it's not the astringency, it is the more the antioxidants and aromatic compounds in it that help with that. Tea is a plant that I purchase because it is not, it doesn't grow around here, and it's not even that easy to grow around here. You can grow it in a greenhouse, but it's fairly labor intensive to do it that way. So I usually purchase tea, and I have a couple of concerns when purchasing tea because of the way that the history of tea is tied in with the history of imperialism. There are often tea plantations where people are working in pretty much slave-like conditions. And so I try to purchase tea that is fair trade, that's where an outside party has come in and certified that that's not what's going on, that people who are producing this tea are being paid a reasonable price for it and for their labor. And also organic. I like to buy organic tea because the production of it can be somewhat chemically intensive, and because it's grown in some places where there might not be much oversight, where there might not be a lot of resources going towards making sure that occupational stuff is done in a good way. I like to make sure that I'm getting stuff that's grown organically and it's been certified as such by an outside source. So usually I buy it from Frontier Co-op, and they have, multiple different varieties available. So yeah, those are some concerns that I like to make sure that I'm addressing when I'm purchasing any kind of herb, but tea is one that I definitely do use and that I do purchase rather than sourcing it myself from the wild or uh, from a grower directly. So I especially want to make sure that there is some chain of custody, some way of knowing that I'm getting what I think I'm getting, and all of that. Tea. It's not an herb that I use a lot in the clinic, but I do use it some. And it's got a wide variety of different uses, like I've discussed, and it's got some. It's got a lot of cultural familiarity for people, so it's not weird or spooky or gross to people, and it's fairly readily available as well, just because of its position in the global economy and all that. But anyway, that's tea. It's probably the world's most accessible stimulant herb. I would say without doubt it is the world's most accessible stimulant herb. It's probably quite possibly the most widely consumed beverage other than water in the world. So there are many different local traditions for how tea is prepared and how it's used and things like that, but it's often part of the human diet in a wide range of places, and has a wide range of medicinal uses as well. And then the other herb that I want to talk about today, which is kind of a flip side of a very similar type of thing, is chamomile. Chamomile is a member of the daisy family, the Asteraceae family, the same as daisies. It looks a little bit like a daisy with a yellow disc and white rays, but the disc is sort of dome shaped instead of being flat. So they look almost like little balls. In my language, in Irish, it's called Chamomile, which it sort of means like a common is a kind of a club used in a sport called hurling, and the mal means ball. So it kind of reminded people of a ball used in hurling, and the name chamomile was similar enough to it that they turned it into common mal to mean hurley stick ball, which is not normally what those balls are called, but that's the name for it in Irish. And just kind of like they took the sound of the word and gave it a fictitious backstory in the language, but it looks ball shaped is the important part, and it's an easy plant to grow. It's not native here. There is a wild chamomile that does grow in central Kentucky that is in bloom right now, which I posted a little video of on my Instagram. But the common chamomile of commerce is Matricaria recutita, which is sometimes called German chamomile. There's another herb called Roman chamomile or Anthemus nobilis, and that's a somewhat different plant. It looks kind of similar, but it's not super closely related to the chamomile that's the usual thing in chamomile tea. So when I say chamomile without any other qualifications, I mean the one that people call German chamomile. And that's what chamomile tea generally consists of. And chamomile tea is one of the more commonly consumed beverages in the world too. I don't know exactly what number it is, but I'd say it's probably, you know, after tea and coffee and maybe milk, it's one of the most common things that people drink. It's a very widely traded and very widely consumed herbal tea. And quite contrary to what camellia is, it is a sedative. It's a very mild sedative. Specifically, it's what we might call a hypnotic sedative. And what hypnotic sedative means is that it produces sleep. So if you take enough of it, it produces a normal state of sleep. Whereas if you take some other sedating things like, say, opium or even valerian, the state that you get into is not normal sleep. Even if you take enough of it that you're not conscious, what's going on is not what normally goes on when you're asleep. Chamomile just helps you fall asleep, and then you're asleep and you can wake up just like normal, and you have dreams the way that someone normally would when they're asleep, and all that sort of thing. So it is something that produces a true sleep state, and in lower doses helps to allay anxiety. One of the substances in chamomile is called apigenin, and apigenin is found in some other plants as well. It binds to the same site on GABA receptors that on certain nerve cells, it binds to the same proteins as a class of drugs called benzodiazepines. Chamomile is not a benzodiazepine structurally, but it attaches to the same proteins in the nerves that those drugs do. So it has a similar effect in some ways in terms of just being calming, but also crucially, it's important not to take both of them together, because what can happen is that the chamomile can actually get in the way of the more powerful benzodiazepine and keep it from working. So if somebody is anxious and they take chamomile and it doesn't work for them, and then they take Xanax, the Xanax probably isn't going to work for them either, because the chamomile is already in the spot that the Xanax would need to attach to. Now, if you just took more chamomile, you might get a better result, or if you took something else entirely, you might get a better result too. But generally speaking, it is a very mild sedative. It's not a super powerful thing. It's something that's in the doses in which it's typically used, calms people, doesn't usually make people very overpoweringly drowsy. But if you take it when you're trying to go to sleep, it does give you a nudge in that direction and makes falling asleep a little bit easier and makes staying asleep a little bit easier as well. So that's probably the most common thing that chamomile is used for, is just allaying the nerves somewhat and helping to promote sleep. And it has a very pleasant taste. A lot of people say that it tastes kind of like apples, or that it smells like apples and tastes like sweet hay or something like that. But it's generally something people find pretty pleasant. Nice tasting enough that people would drink it just for pleasure rather than tolerate it because it's medicinal. It doesn't really taste very medicine-y. It tastes sweet and pleasant. And that's one of the reasons that it's very popular. There are some people who are allergic to chamomile. You can be allergic to just about anything. As far as I know, there have only ever been a couple of cases of very moderate to severe allergies to chamomile, but much has been made out of them in the press. And a lot of the time people will say, if you're allergic to ragweed, you might also be allergic to chamomile, because they're in the same family. And I don't think that really stands to reason, because lettuce is in that family and sunflowers are in that family. And nobody says, if you're allergic to ragweed, you might also be allergic to lettuce. If you're allergic to ragweed, you might also be allergic to sunflowers. If you're allergic to ragweed, you're allergic to inhaling the pollen from ragweed. We don't usually talk about ragweed as a food allergy. If you're allergic to chamomile, that's more like a food allergy, um, and not necessarily a sinus pollen type allergy. So, I don't think, even though people with a lot of allergies are probably allergic to ragweed and they might also be allergic to chamomile. So there may be some crossover, but I don't think that there's any reason to suspect that there's actually cross sensitivity where the allergy to ragweed would make you allergic to chamomile, or that the allergy to ragweed would be a strong predictor of allergy to chamomile. The ragweed allergy is very, very common, and chamomile allergy is not very common at all. But it does exist. And so some people, have taken it and noticed that they felt allergic afterwards and had to stop. That being said, it also contains some antihistamine substances and can sometimes help with allergies. Can sometimes help. It can really sometimes help people who have allergies to fall asleep instead of feeling miserable because they're having a hard time breathing. And it can also alleviate the inflammation that's caused by the histamine response too sometimes. So it is a drowsiness causing antihistamine. But chamomile, generally speaking, is extremely well tolerated. People use it for children all the time. A little bit of water-based extract of chamomile can be used for babies that are teething. Sometimes it helps to soothe the pain, and it also helps to promote salivation, which for some reason seems to soothe gums of babies that are teething as well. So it's versatile in that way, and generally it's safe enough to give to kids, and it is a pretty common ingredient in remedies for kids. Some of which may be because people like to give kids things that calm them down, which I don't necessarily think is, I think it's better to deal with their extreme energy and teach them to handle it through discipline rather than sedating them. But, everybody's kids are a little different, and everybody's approaches to how they deal with them are a little different too. And I respect that. But, it is something that at least is safe enough to use for children, and is not associated with being habit forming in any meaningful way or addictive. It doesn't tend to make people, if people take it to fall asleep, they usually don't feel groggy the next day, which can be an issue with some things that cause sedation. So it's pretty short-lived in terms of that effect, but strong enough to make a difference. Yeah, 1-year-old triplets all teething at the same time. Wow, that's some work. But yeah, you can give it to them in small amounts. I'd brew a strong tea of it, and see if you can get them to take a little spoonful of it, or I've heard of people like dipping a cold rag in it and letting them chew on that as well as another way of administering it. When my kids were little, I just had it like in a little dropper and put it in between their cheek and gum towards the back of their mouth, and that sometimes helped. And maybe popsicles, that would be interesting. I have not tried that approach, but yeah, it's topically for the gums tends to be helpful. And also, calms them down, might help them sleep if they're feeling irritable, or if the pain is keeping them from being able to sleep. So that's it's a useful thing. And sometimes it's just that it's giving them something different to feel and do with their mouth, other than yell, other than cry. Because they're tasting it and they're feeling the sensation of it in their mouth and stuff. But it does have some decent effect that's not super overpowering. I guess that's the thing I'm trying to say about it, is the chamomile does not tend to be overpowering the way that some medicines and even some other herbs can be when it comes to calming the nervous system down. So I use chamomile all the time for people who just have general anxiety. A lot of the time I'll give them something to take once a day and then have them have a little bottle of chamomile, or maybe chamomile and another herb that they can just take a little bit under their tongue as needed throughout the day if they start to feel anxious. And it's something that you can't really overdose on, or that's not going to make you anything other than a little bit tired if you take too much of it. So it's kind of like your most basic, most gentle level of herbal sedative. Now, with chamomile and with tea, they can both be used to help get the circadian rhythm aligned with the daytime and the nighttime and all of that, making it so that somebody is able to wake up when they need to wake up and go to sleep when they need to go to sleep. But if you're using them, if you're leaning on them to try and make somebody have a schedule that's not very natural, like if you're working the night shift and you're having to wake up at 9 in the night and stay up until 10 in the morning or something like that, using them that way, using either or both of them that way, when essentially what you're doing is contrary to your nature, might be not the healthiest thing, because you're forcing yourself to stay up, you're forcing yourself to fall asleep, which is essentially more to do with the job than the herbs. But even so, that might not be the healthiest way to use them, and might sometimes lead to people having bad dreams or discomfort. Sometimes people get to a state where they're not feeling like they can wake up or sleep very fully, like they're not all the way awake when they're awake and not all the way asleep when they're asleep. And that can be really uncomfortable. So, for the most part, I just kind of urge everybody to try and avoid that situation in the first place, rather than using stimulants and sedatives, including but not limited to caffeine and chamomile, to tough it out. It's important. There's no substitute for getting enough sleep. And for most of us, there's no substitute for getting sleep during a reasonable time of day. The night shift is kind of unnatural. I mean, I've had times in my life where I was doing it and where I felt that that's what I had to do to get by. But I think it's good to get out of those situations if you can, when you can, because they can, some people tolerate them better than others. And when I was younger, I could tolerate them okay. I think if I had to try them now, it would be much less pleasant. Hang on a moment, I'll be right back. All right. All right. Any question about either of those herbs or either of those techniques for making medicine? All right. So, it's going to be June in the next couple days, and I'll be sending out invoices again to people who are doing it that way. And I would really encourage everybody, like I said, to get out into the natural world and look at some of the plants that are out there. Familiarize yourself with them, take some pictures or pick some flowers and press them between the pages of a book. Start trying to use a field guide or plant app or anything like that. If you are out in the world and you encounter a plant that you don't know what is, feel free to send me a picture of it and say, hey, what do you think this is, or whatever, and I would be glad to help you with that. That is part of what I'm here for. Also, if you're doing that, try and get as clear a picture of the flower and the leaf as you can, because that will really make the job a lot easier. If you're out in the woods and fields and things like that, make sure you watch out for poison ivy and copperheads, and check yourself for ticks when you're done, because all of that is a very real part of what's out there right now. But also, I would say, don't be scared of any of those things. Just, watch out for them. And try and, do as much as you can to build awareness of the natural world around you, because that is really where your strength as a healer comes from. Your unique ability to act as sort of an intermediary between the plant world and the people world. And that's going to grow and grow and strengthen as you learn more. But it will do so quickly, and it will do so more quickly and more powerfully if you spend some time out in the world looking at things. So I posted that link to the plant walk. It's about 2 hours long, but there are bits of it you can fast forward through where we're just walking from place to place. But it's a really nice plant walk, a really nice look around at what's growing in central Kentucky right now. And there's some good stuff out there. The next plant walk will be in a couple months, and it'll be a different season by then, and we'll probably also go to a different place. So we'll see, a totally different set of plants. But in that particular plant walk, there's plants growing around the pond. There's plants growing around old buildings. There's plants growing out in fields that are transitioning from meadow to forest, and there are plants growing in some second growth forests. So a lot of small habitats in a relatively small area, a lot of variety. So set aside some time and check that out. It's, I think, very much worth the time that it would take to listen to it. And, that's something that I hope with the next one that everybody will get a chance to make it to. And if you have any questions about the plant walk, feel free to message me directly about those too. If you leave questions in the comment section or anything like that, I'll get back to those too. But if you message me directly, I'll see it sooner. So yeah, that's about it for this time, unless anybody has any questions. And so I will see you all again next Tuesday. Thanks.